Long before the name Jedi carried weight across the stars, before the first lightsaber hummed in the hands of a warrior monk, there were only whispers in the dark, subtle forces at work, unseen yet ever present. The oldest beings to walk the galaxy knew nothing of destiny, yet they felt the pull of something vast and endless, threading its way through the fabric of existence. They did not name it. They simply lived within its embrace, moving as it willed, never questioning, never resisting. This is the story of those first seekers, those who listened and learned, who shaped the knowledge that would one day become legend. Tonight, as the stars hold their silent vigil, allow these distant echoes of the past to guide you. Let the gentle current of time carry you through the forgotten millennia, where the Force was neither light nor dark, but a quiet presence in the breath of all things. There are records of those early days, though they are scattered, their truths buried beneath the passing of ages. Some speak of Tython, a world veiled in mist, where great storms raged across sky and stone, stirred by the energy that pulsed within its core. It was said that the first to sense this power did not seek to control it. They knelt in its presence, feeling its currents shift around them, accepting its embrace with quiet reverence. To them, the Force was not a tool, nor a means to an end. It was life itself, a whisper on the wind, a pulse in the earth beneath their feet. The beings who first felt its call were scattered across many worlds. Some were born beneath twin suns, their days bathed in golden heat, their nights stretching into the vast unknown. Others walked through frozen valleys, where silence stretched unbroken for miles, and the stars seemed close enough to touch. Each felt the presence of something greater, something unseen but ever present. They did not yet have words to describe it, nor did they seek to define it. They simply knew. In those days, the Force moved freely, unshaped by doctrine or discipline. It called to those who could hear, stirring within them a quiet knowing. Some felt it as warmth, a gentle glow within the soul. Others sensed it as a shadow, vast and unknowable, stretching beyond the edges of perception. It was neither a blessing nor a curse, neither a gift nor a burden. It simply was, as eternal as the stars themselves. The first to embrace its presence did not yet understand its nature, but they knew that it spoke in ways beyond words. They learned to listen, to the way leaves turned in the wind, to the ripples on the water, to the shifting patterns of the sky. They did not seek to command these forces, only to understand them. In time, their connection deepened, and with it came the first stirrings of power. A hand extended could coax a flame to life. A whispered thought could still a raging storm. These first wielders of the Force did not think of themselves as warriors or sages. They were simply attuned to something vast and unseen, moving with its currents rather than against them. There were no temples, no sacred texts, no councils to dictate their path. Only the endless sky above and the steady pull of something ancient beneath their feet. For centuries they remained scattered, their knowledge passing quietly from one generation to the next. But the Force is not stagnant. It flows, shifts, evolves, and so too did those who could touch it. Some began to seek more than understanding. They wished to shape the power they had been given, to bend it to their will. Others feared such ambition, believing that the Force was not theirs to command, but to honor. Thus, the first divisions began to form, subtle at first, like ripples on the surface of a great lake. Some wished only to listen and follow. Others wished to harness and wield. The seeds of future conflict were sown in those early days, though none could yet see the path they would take. It was on Tython, beneath skies ever shifting, that the first true gathering of Force sensitives took place. They were drawn together by the same invisible current that had guided them their entire lives. Some came seeking knowledge, others to share what they had learned. There, for the first time, the Force was discussed as something greater than the sum of its parts, something that could be understood, studied, and, perhaps, mastered. The dreamlike days of unspoken understanding were fading. In their place came the first teachings, the first attempts to shape the knowledge that had once flowed freely. For some, this was a path to enlightenment. For others, it was the beginning of control. The balance between these two views would shape the future of the galaxy in ways no one could yet foresee. But for now, in these ancient times, there was still peace. The Force had found its first listeners, its first keepers of wisdom, and though their journey was only beginning, their footsteps were steady, their purpose clear. Let these echoes of the past drift with you as the night deepens. The story continues, as all things must. But for now, rest in the quiet knowledge that even in the oldest days, the Force was there, waiting to be heard. Tython was unlike any other world, a place where the Force did not merely flow, it roared. Its skies were alive with restless storms, its land shaped by unseen hands, shifting between moments of stillness and violent upheaval. The very air carried a presence, something vast and knowing, as if the planet itself breathed in harmony with the energy coursing through its depths. Few worlds had ever known such a bond with the Force, and perhaps none ever would again. Those drawn to Tython in the earliest ages did not arrive by accident. They were summoned, carried through the void in vessels older than recorded time, great monolithic starships known as the Thoyor. These silent behemoths traveled without pilots, moved without engines, appearing above distant worlds like sentinels from another age. No record existed of their makers, no known civilization claimed them, yet their purpose was clear. They sought those who could hear the call, those who felt the quiet hum of something unseen, guiding their hands, their thoughts, their very souls. The chosen were not all alike. They came from distant worlds, from different stars, each carrying their own understanding of existence. Some were warriors, tempered by battle, their senses sharpened by years of survival. Others were seekers, drawn to mysteries beyond their grasp, eager to find the source of the quiet whispers that had followed them since birth. They did not share language or history, yet when the Thoyor brought them to Tython, they found something familiar in one another. A shared recognition, not in name or face, but in the way they felt the presence of the Force around them. Tython welcomed them, though it did not grant them peace. The planet was restless, its energies ever shifting, forcing those who lived upon it to adapt. Those who grew too bold found the ground trembling beneath their feet. Those who sought to withdraw into isolation found the winds rising against them. The Force did not favor strength or restraint alone. It demanded something deeper, something harder to grasp. Balance. It became clear that the world itself responded to the emotions of those who walked upon its surface. When harmony was kept, the skies calmed, the rivers flowed gently, the air carried a sense of clarity. But when conflict took root, the land rebelled. Storms tore across the horizon, tremors rattled the stone foundations of the first settlements, and the very atmosphere seemed to darken. Tython was a mirror, reflecting the turmoil of those who sought to understand it. The earliest inhabitants recognized this quickly, though each interpreted it in their own way. Some believed the planet tested them, forging them into something greater. Others saw it as a warning, a lesson to be learned. They did not yet have a name for what they were becoming, but they knew they were changing. The Force was no longer something they merely felt. It was something they lived alongside, something they had to honor and respect. In time, the first structures began to take shape. Not temples, not yet, but places of gathering, open spaces where knowledge was shared, where those who had spent years in meditation passed down what they had learned. There were no rulers, no leaders to dictate the way forward, only travelers, scholars, and wanderers, each bringing their own understanding, each leaving behind a fragment of wisdom. They learned from the planet, from the way its storms rose and fell, from the way its energies shifted with the tides of emotion. Balance became their guiding principle, though none yet spoke of the light or the dark. Such ideas had not yet taken form. They only knew that to live in harmony with the Force, one could not give in to extremes. Too much order brought stagnation. Too much passion invited chaos. Tython itself was proof of this, a world that gave only as much as it received. Some sought to deepen their understanding, pushing the limits of what the Force would allow. They tested its boundaries, reaching beyond what was known, seeking ways to harness its power. Others urged restraint, warning that such ambitions could bring disruption. These debates did not yet lead to war, but they lingered in the air like distant thunder. For now, there was peace, but it was fragile, delicate. The world had gathered its first true guardians, though they did not yet know what they would become. Their journey was still in its infancy, their teachings unwritten, their destiny unwoven. The Force had called them here, had bound them to this world, and in the silence of the night, as the wind whispered through the valleys, Tython watched over them, waiting. The story does not end here. It is only beginning. Let the past unfold. Let the voices of those who walked before speak once more. Their path is not yet clear, but the Force is with them. Always. The first seekers of the Force on Tython did not yet call themselves Judii. They were wanderers, scholars, and warriors who had come together under the guidance of the planet's ever-shifting energies. They studied the storms, the tremors in the land, the way Tython responded to their emotions and actions. Through this, they began to understand that the Force itself carried two great currents. One was warmth, clarity, and creation. The other was power, passion, and destruction. The ancient Tythons named them Ashla and Bogan. Ashla was the light, the gentle hand that healed, the wisdom that guided, the stillness of meditation. Bogan was the dark, the surge of raw emotion, the will to act, the force that could shatter stone. Neither was inherently good nor evil. They simply were, and both were necessary. One without the other led to imbalance, and Tython had already shown them what imbalance could bring. To stray too far into either would invite the world's wrath. The storms would rise, the land would quake, the Force itself would rebel. It was in this understanding that the Jedi Order was born. They were not yet Jedi nor Sith. They did not swear themselves to light or dark, nor did they see the Force as something to be divided. Their path was one of balance, and their training reflected this. Across Tython, they built great temples, each dedicated to a different aspect of the Force. These were not places of worship, but of learning, centers where the first disciples of the Force honed their skills under the watchful eyes of those who had come before them. Each temple had a purpose, a discipline to teach. Some focused on the mind, training students in philosophy and meditation, the art of listening to the Force rather than bending it to their will. Others studied the body, perfecting the forms of combat, learning how to channel power with discipline. There were temples for healers, where the wounded were mended not just with hands, but with the energy of the Force itself. Others trained warriors who would protect Tython, mastering weapons both traditional and those enhanced by their connection to the unseen. Every Jedi was expected to train in all disciplines, to know both Ashla and Bogan, to walk the path between them. To lean too far in one direction was considered dangerous. Those who fell out of balance were not cast out, nor were they condemned. Instead, they were sent away, to the moons that hung above Tython, one bathed in light, the other cloaked in shadow. There, in isolation, they meditated until they could return to the center, until they could once again walk the path of balance. For a time, this way of life flourished. The Jedi grew in number, their wisdom deepened, their knowledge expanded. They explored the depths of the Force, not as something to conquer, but as something to understand. The balance they maintained allowed them to thrive, and the world remained at peace. But harmony is never eternal. Some among the Jedi began to question the old ways. They saw power in the currents of Ashla, the serenity and strength that came from purity of purpose. Others were drawn to Bogan, feeling the thrill of its raw, untamed might. These were not yet divisions, not yet battles waged in the name of light and dark, but the beginnings of something deeper, something that stirred beneath the surface, waiting to be unleashed. The Force is not static. It moves, it shifts, it calls to those who listen. And some began to listen too closely. Whispers of power, of destiny, of paths that did not need to be shared. There were those who believed balance was a constraint, a limit imposed by those who feared the true potential of the Force. There were those who saw the Jedi teachings as a barrier, something that held them back from what they could become. For now, the Order held. The temples still stood, and those who walked the path of balance still guided the way. But the seeds had been planted. The Jedi did not yet know it, but their way of life was fragile. The balance they cherished would not last forever. The Force does not favor stagnation. It moves forward, always forward. The Jedi had built something strong, something wise, but change was coming. And Tython, as always, would be the first to know. For centuries, the Jedi walked the path of balance, shaping their teachings around the harmony between Ashla and Bogan. Their temples stood as monuments to knowledge, their traditions guided by the belief that to embrace the Force fully, one must walk between its two great currents. But balance is delicate, and beneath the surface of this unity, something had begun to shift. The first whispers of division were quiet, no more than debates held in the halls of the great temples. Some believed Ashla, the guiding light, was the true path to wisdom. They saw peace in its embrace, a clarity that allowed one to rise above the chaos of emotion. Others argued that Bogan, the raw energy of the dark, held the key to true understanding. Passion, strength, and the will to shape one's own destiny. These were not things to be feared but embraced. At first, these differences remained philosophical. The Jedi had always encouraged discourse, believing that through understanding both sides of the Force, one could find enlightenment. But as the generations passed, the divide deepened. Some Jedi no longer sought balance. They trained only in the ways of Ashla, seeking mastery through discipline and detachment. Others surrendered themselves to Bogan, casting aside restraint and embracing the power within. Tython itself began to respond. The skies darkened more often, storms rising with greater fury. The ground trembled, the rivers ran wild. The balance that had once held the world in harmony was unraveling. Those who still followed the old ways warned that a great reckoning was coming, but their voices were drowned out by those who saw the split as inevitable. The Jedi had reached a point where coexistence was no longer possible. The Force was calling them to choose a path. The first battles were small, isolated skirmishes between those who called themselves disciples of Ashla and those who followed Bogan's path. Arguments turned to duels, and duels turned to bloodshed. The great temples, once places of peace and learning, became battlegrounds. Knowledge that had been shared for generations became weapons in the hands of those who sought victory. The Force Wars had begun. Tython bore the full weight of the conflict. The storms grew relentless, the very land shifting as if trying to purge the chaos that had taken root. Cities crumbled, forests burned, and the rivers that had once flowed with the energy of the Force ran dry. The warriors of Ashla wielded their power with precision, shaping the Force into a tool of order. Those of Bogan struck with relentless fury, drawing upon raw emotion to crush their enemies. The war raged for years, each side seeking dominance, neither willing to yield. The Jedi Order, once unified in purpose, was shattered. Some tried to stand in the middle, urging restraint, but the battle had gone too far. The planet itself could not withstand the strain. A final cataclysm tore through Tython, reshaping the land, leaving scars that would never heal. The echoes of that destruction would linger for millennia, a reminder of what had been lost. When the fighting finally ceased, there were few left to witness the end. The survivors gathered among the ruins, weary and broken. They saw what had been done, what their war had cost. The Judii were no more. The path of balance had crumbled beneath the weight of those who sought to control the Force rather than understand it. But even in the ashes of their order, something remained. Those who had followed Ashla took what knowledge they could and set forth to build something new. They would learn from the mistakes of the past, shaping a new philosophy, one that rejected the darkness and embraced only the light. They would become the first Jedi. The remnants of Bogan's disciples did not accept defeat. They fled into the stars, carrying their teachings with them, seeking a place where their power would not be restrained. In time, they would become something far darker. Their war was not over. The Force had not chosen a side. It remained as it always had, moving, flowing, watching. The battle for its future had only just begun. Tython was quiet. The storms that had once mirrored the conflict of the Jedi had settled, leaving behind a scarred world and a broken order. The Force Wars had reshaped everything. Those who survived stood among the ruins of their temples, carrying the weight of what had been lost. There was no celebration, no victory, only the realization that balance had failed. The Jedi were no more. What remained were those who had seen the dangers of Bogan, the chaos it unleashed, the destruction it brought. They vowed to ensure that such devastation would never come again. The survivors did not stay on Tython. They left, scattering across the stars, seeking a new home where they could rebuild. Some traveled to Ossus, a world rich with knowledge, its vast landscapes offering a place for reflection and renewal. Others wandered farther, settling on distant moons and quiet planets, places where the echoes of war could no longer reach them. They carried with them the teachings of Ashla, the belief that the Force was best understood through serenity, control, and peace. It was during these years that they ceased to call themselves Judii. That name belonged to an era of balance, to a time when they had believed the Force could be embraced in all its forms. The war had proven otherwise. Bogan had led to suffering, to destruction, to madness. To prevent the mistakes of the past, they would walk a different path. They would become Jedi. Their teachings began to shift. Where the Jedi had sought to walk between Ashla and Bogan, the Jedi embraced Ashla alone. The Force was not to be wielded as a weapon of power, but as a guide, a path to enlightenment. Emotion was seen as dangerous, a force that could cloud judgment and lead to darkness. Passion led to conflict, fear led to anger, chaos led to ruin. They had seen the truth of this in the ashes of Tython, and they would not allow history to repeat itself. On Ossus, the first true Jedi enclave took shape. It was not built with grandeur in mind. There were no towering structures, no sprawling halls of marble and stone. The Jedi sought simplicity, a life of contemplation and discipline. They gathered texts, recorded what knowledge had survived the war, and sought to refine their teachings. The past had been shaped by imbalance, by warriors seeking power for its own sake. The Jedi would be different. They did not reject combat entirely. The galaxy was vast, and danger would always exist. But strength would no longer be measured by raw ability. The Jedi trained to defend, not to conquer. Their weapons, once tools of both Ashla and Bogan, became symbols of discipline. They wielded them not with pride, but with caution, understanding that the act of drawing a blade should always be the last resort. In time, their numbers grew. Others, drawn to their teachings, came seeking wisdom. The Jedi welcomed them, though they were careful. The wounds of the Force Wars had not yet healed, and they knew how easily the old ways could return. Their students were taught to surrender themselves to the Force, to let go of attachment, to find peace in detachment, to love too deeply, to grieve too greatly. These were paths to suffering. The Jedi did not hate. They did not seek revenge. They did not allow the past to define them. The galaxy took notice. The Jedi were not warlords, nor were they rulers. They did not seek control, yet their presence carried weight. Their wisdom was sought by those who wished to avoid conflict, their guidance valued by those who sought peace. They did not call themselves guardians, yet they became protectors of those who could not protect themselves. But even as they grew, the memory of the past remained. They had seen what came from unchecked ambition, from passion left untamed, and beyond the quiet halls of Ossus, beyond the stars where they now dwelled, there were those who had not abandoned Bogan, those who had fled, who had seen the war not as a warning but as unfinished business. They waited, far from the reach of the Jedi, in places where the light could not touch. The Jedi did not fear them. Fear was a path to darkness. But they knew this peace would not last forever. The Force was always in motion. It had brought them to this moment, had shaped them through war and loss. They had emerged stronger, wiser, but the past was never truly gone. It waited, as it always had, just beyond the horizon. The Jedi had found their purpose, but their path was still unshaped. The Force Wars had taught them that balance was fragile, that the unchecked pull of emotion could lead even the wisest astray. They had seen what happened when power became obsession, when passion blurred judgment. The remnants of the Judii knew that if their new order was to endure, they would need more than just a name. They needed principles, a foundation that would guide them away from the chaos they had once known. The first discussions were held in the halls of the Jedi enclaves, where the survivors gathered to shape the future. They spoke of the past, of the mistakes that had brought ruin to Tython. The war had begun not with armies, but with beliefs, conflicting views on how the Force should be wielded. Some had sought control, others surrender, but all had ultimately fallen to their own convictions. The Jedi would not make the same error. They would build a way of life, not just a philosophy. The greatest concern was Bogan. The dark side had proven its danger, its ability to corrupt even those who once walked the path of wisdom. But fear of Bogan was a danger in itself. Fear was a gateway to destruction, a path that could lead to control, to oppression. The Jedi did not seek dominance over the Force. They sought understanding. Their rules could not be built upon fear, nor could they be enforced with punishment. They had to be a guide, not a shackle. It was agreed that emotion would be their first test. The Force Wars had begun when passions had grown unchecked, when anger had become a weapon instead of a warning. The Jedi understood that emotions were natural, but they also saw how easily they could spiral beyond control. Passion led to attachment. Attachment led to fear of loss. Fear of loss led to desperation. Desperation led to destruction. If the Jedi were to maintain peace within themselves, they would need discipline. Early Jedi masters debated the meaning of restraint. Some believed all emotion should be set aside, that a Jedi should walk through life untouched by the weight of feeling. Others argued that emotion itself was not the enemy, only the reckless surrender to it. A compromise was found. The Jedi would not deny their emotions, but they would master them. A Jedi could feel sorrow but not be consumed by it. A Jedi could care but never to the point of obsession. They would embrace peace over passion, clarity over impulse. From these discussions, the first form of the Jedi Code was spoken, though it was not yet set in stone. It was a teaching, a mantra to remind those who followed the path why they walked it. It began simply, "There is no ignorance, there is knowledge." The Jedi would not fear what they did not understand. They would seek wisdom in all things, learning from the past so they would not repeat its mistakes. There is no passion, there is serenity. Emotion would not rule them. They would act not from anger, not from desire, but from the quiet stillness of a mind at peace. There is no chaos, there is harmony. The Force was not a battlefield, nor a tool to be wielded recklessly. It was a current, flowing through all things, bringing order to the universe. There is no death, there is the Force. Life was not bound to the flesh. The Force connected all things, and in it, nothing was ever truly lost. These words were spoken, not as law, but as a guide, a lesson for those who wished to walk the path of the Jedi. It was not yet doctrine, nor did it carry rigid enforcement. The Jedi understood that their order was still young, that their understanding of the Force would continue to evolve. What mattered was the intent behind the words, to steer away from the chaos that had nearly destroyed them. The Jedi Code was not universally accepted at first. Some questioned whether it restricted too much, whether it would one day lead to stagnation. Others feared that by rejecting passion, the Jedi would also reject love, ambition, and personal drive. There were voices that warned against rules that demanded too much of those who followed them. But the Jedi were patient. They did not seek to force their teachings upon those who did not accept them. In time, the path would reveal itself. Though the Jedi Code remained fluid in these early years, its core belief held firm. The Force was a responsibility, not a right. To wield it without discipline was to risk falling into darkness. They had seen what happened when the Force was used without restraint. They would not allow it to happen again. Their order was still taking shape, but its foundation had been laid. The Jedi had their purpose, their philosophy. The Force would guide them, as it always had. But what they had built was only the beginning. The galaxy was vast, and beyond the walls of their enclaves, others still sought to control what the Jedi had chosen to serve. The challenges ahead would test them in ways they could not yet foresee. The Jedi believed they had found stability. Their code provided structure, their teachings guided new generations, and their enclaves became places of wisdom rather than conflict. They had risen from the ashes of the Force Wars, determined to ensure that history would not repeat itself. Yet beneath the surface of their unity, there were those who felt the Jedi had abandoned something vital. Not all who had once walked the Jedi path agreed with the new stance. The rejection of Bogan, the strict adherence to Ashla, and the growing restrictions on emotion were seen by some as limitations rather than enlightenment. The Force, they argued, was not meant to be divided. The Jedi had understood this, embracing both sides rather than choosing one. But the Jedi had turned away from that balance, reshaping their philosophy into something narrow, something that denied half of what the Force had to offer. At first, these disagreements were quiet. Those who questioned the Jedi's path voiced their concerns in the halls of the enclaves, seeking discourse rather than defiance. They pointed to the past, reminding their brothers and sisters that Ashla alone had not saved them from war. The Force Wars had not been caused by balance. It had been the attempt to suppress one aspect of the Force that had led to division. But the Jedi saw things differently. The war had not been a failure of balance. It had been proof of Bogan's corruption. Those who had embraced the dark side had become consumed by it, turning against their own kind, allowing their passions to dictate their actions. The Jedi had witnessed firsthand what happened when power was left unchecked, and they would not allow it to happen again. Tensions grew. The Jedi who questioned these teachings were not yet traitors, nor were they enemies. They were scholars, warriors, thinkers, those who sought a different path, one not bound by the rigid interpretation of Ashla. Some sought knowledge beyond what was permitted, delving into ancient texts and practices that had been cast aside in the wake of the Force Wars. Others trained in secret, believing that denying one's emotions did not strengthen a Jedi but weakened them. The Jedi Council, still in its earliest form, watched these developments with unease. They did not act quickly. They did not rush to judgment. The Jedi did not seek to rule through fear, nor did they desire to become oppressors. But they had drawn a line, and those who crossed it would have to face the consequences. The breaking point came when some of these dissenters began teaching their own students, passing down knowledge that the Jedi had forbidden. These teachings spoke of power, of strength beyond restraint. They taught that the Jedi Code was not a path to enlightenment, but a chain forged from fear. The Jedi Order had chosen safety over truth, rejecting the full scope of the Force in favor of a controlled existence. When the Council finally acted, it was not with anger, but with finality. Those who refused to renounce their ways were given a choice: surrender their teachings and remain within the Jedi, or leave and walk their own path beyond the Order. Some accepted exile willingly, believing that the Jedi had strayed too far from the truth to be corrected. Others left with bitterness in their hearts, convinced that the Jedi were blind to the Force's true nature. These exiles would later be known as the first Dark Jedi, though at the time they carried no such name. They did not yet see themselves as a separate order, nor did they all share the same beliefs. Some sought knowledge, others power, but all had one thing in common. They had been cast out by those who had once been their brothers and sisters. They vanished into the stars, scattered across distant worlds, seeking refuge in places beyond the Jedi's reach. Some wandered alone, continuing their studies in isolation. Others gathered in secret, forming small enclaves of their own, refining the teachings that had led to their exile. The Jedi did not pursue them. They had no desire for war, nor did they believe that those who left posed an immediate threat. But the seeds had been planted. The division that had begun as a debate had now become something greater. A rift had formed in the legacy of the Force, one that would only grow wider with time. For now, the Jedi continued forward, believing they had done what was necessary. Their order was strong, their code intact. But beyond their borders, in places where shadows stretched long, those they had cast out were watching, waiting. The story was not over. It had only just begun. Korriban was a world shaped by death. Its surface, a vast expanse of blood-colored sand and jagged cliffs, bore the weight of countless centuries. The air was thick with the whispers of the past, echoes of power and ambition that had long since faded, yet never truly vanished. The Force clung to the land, but unlike Tython, where it ebbed and flowed with the balance of Ashla and Bogan, here it pulsed with raw intensity. There was no harmony, no measured equilibrium, only dominance and submission. The native Sith species had long adapted to this unforgiving world. Tall, red-skinned, with piercing eyes that burned like embers, they were as much a part of Korriban as the mountains and storms that raged above its surface. They were born into struggle, hardened by a land that offered no kindness. To survive was to be strong. To falter was to be forgotten. This was not merely a belief. It was the foundation of their existence. Their civilization, ruled by warlords and sorcerers, revolved around the mastery of the Force. But unlike the Jedi, they did not seek to suppress their emotions. They wielded them. Anger fueled their strength. Passion sharpened their minds. Power was not something to be denied but embraced. For millennia, they built tombs for their greatest warriors, grand structures that stood as monuments to their might. Even in death, their rulers commanded fear, their spirits lingering in the halls of their resting places, bound to the darkness they had once controlled. Their history was written in conquest, in betrayal, in the struggle for supremacy. This was the way of the Sith. It had always been. Then the exiles arrived. They came not as conquerors, not at first. They were wanderers, former Jedi who had turned away from Ashla, seeking the knowledge their order had forbidden. The dark side had called to them, whispered promises of strength and understanding beyond the rigid laws of the Jedi. Cast out for their defiance, they had searched for a place to rebuild, to refine their teachings away from the prying eyes of those who had rejected them. Korriban welcomed them, not with open arms, but with trials of fire and blood. The Sith did not kneel before outsiders, nor did they trust those who claimed wisdom without proving their worth. The exiles had to earn their place, and they did so in the only way the Sith understood, through battle. Those who faltered were struck down, their weakness a stain unworthy of Korriban's legacy. But those who endured, who showed cunning, strength and mastery of the Force, were granted passage into Sith society. In time, they did more than survive. They thrived. The merging of these two paths, the sorcery and strength of the Sith, the knowledge and ambition of the exiled Jedi, created something new, something far greater than either had been before. The Sith species had always known the dark side, but the exiles brought structure, refinement, a deeper understanding of how to wield power beyond instinct. In return, the Sith gave them purpose, a home where their teachings were not only accepted, but revered. Slowly, the exiles rose in status, their influence spreading through Sith culture until they were no longer outsiders. They became kings, priests, lords of war. They took the title of Sith not as a species, but as a legacy, a new order shaped by both blood and ideology. The distinction between the original Sith and the fallen Jedi blurred until there was no difference at all. They were Sith, bound together not by race, but by strength, by the relentless pursuit of power. Yet even in this new era, the old ways of the Sith remained. Betrayal was inevitable. Power demanded conflict. Those who led did so only because they had proven themselves stronger than those beneath them. And so, the Sith Empire was born, not as a single nation, but as a fractured hierarchy where strength dictated rule. The greatest among them would rise as Dark Lords, but their position was never secure. A true Sith ruled only for as long as they could hold their throne. Far from Korriban, the Jedi continued their teachings, unaware of what had been created in the darkness. They had cast out those who sought power, believing that without guidance, they would fade into obscurity. But the Sith had not faded. They had become something more, something stronger. The time would come when they would return, not as exiles, but as conquerors. The Sith had found their rulers. No longer a fragmented collection of warlords and exiles, they had forged something new, an empire built upon strength, ambition, and the unrelenting pursuit of power. The merging of the Dark Jedi with the native Sith species had created a hierarchy where might determined rule, where only the strongest could claim the title of Dark Lord. Among these, one name stood above the rest, Ajunta Pal. He was not the first to wield the dark side, nor the first to claim dominion over others, but he was the one who shaped the Sith into something greater than scattered warlords. A former Jedi exile, he had arrived on Korriban with others like him, cast out for their refusal to submit to the restrictive teachings of Ashla. Unlike many of his fellow outcasts, he had no interest in wandering the fringes of the galaxy, content to hide in the shadows. He saw what the Sith were, strong, ruthless, yet disorganized. He saw what they could become. Ajunta Pal did not seek peace, he sought dominion. The Sith species had long ruled through bloodshed and betrayal, but under his guidance, they were reforged into something deadlier. He united clans through force, crushed opposition without hesitation, and introduced teachings that would become the foundation of Sith philosophy. Power was not to be feared, nor tempered with restraint. It was to be embraced, sharpened, wielded without hesitation. The weak existed to serve the strong, and those who could not rise deserved to be cast aside. Under Ajunta Pal's rule, the Sith expanded beyond Korriban. Zeost became their new capital, a world of frozen wastes and towering citadels, its surface marked by the unyielding will of the dark side. Here the first true Sith empire took shape, built upon the remnants of those who had been conquered. But the Sith were not content to rule over barren landscapes and dust-covered ruins. Their power grew with each world they claimed, each civilization they brought under their dominion. Malachor became a place of great significance, its surface scarred by ancient weapons, its depths steeped in the energy of the dark side. Sith scholars delved into the secrets of forbidden alchemy, twisting flesh and spirit into monstrous creations. The Force was not merely a tool for battle, it was a weapon of transformation. Through their experiments, they forged abominations of war, creatures bound to their will, living extensions of their power. The Sith did not merely conquer, they corrupted. They did not seek to coexist with the galaxy, but to reshape it in their image. They built temples not as places of worship, but as fortresses of knowledge, where only the most worthy could uncover the true depths of the dark side. Their teachings spread, not through kindness or persuasion, but through the raw weight of power. Those who sought their wisdom were tested, their minds and bodies broken down before they were reforged into something greater. Their empire was not without conflict. Sith did not rule through unity, but through dominance. Betrayal was inevitable, a natural order of things. Dark Lords rose and fell, their reigns marked by bloodshed, their power never secure. Even Ajunta Pal, the one who had forged the first empire, was not immune to the nature of the Sith. He was challenged, his rule tested, and though he had built something great, his time passed as all rulers must. But the Sith endured. Their empire did not collapse with the fall of one leader. It grew, reshaped by those who took power, strengthened by conflict rather than weakened by it. They were not like the Jedi, bound by rules and restraint. Their path was chaos, but it was the kind of chaos that bred strength. Far from Ziost and Malachor, beyond the reaches of the Sith Empire, the Jedi remained unaware of what had been created in the darkness. They believed that those they had exiled had vanished into obscurity, that the dangers of Bogan had been left behind. But the Sith were not forgotten. Their empire was growing, their influence spreading, and the day would come when they would no longer remain hidden. The galaxy was vast, but the Sith knew patience. Their time would come, and when it did, the Jedi would learn that the darkness they had cast out had only grown stronger in exile. The Sith Empire had grown in strength, its rulers expanding their dominion across distant worlds, shaping entire civilizations under the rule of the dark side. The Jedi, secure in their enclaves and guided by the wisdom of the Force, remained unaware of what had taken root beyond their borders. For centuries, the two orders had developed in isolation, their teachings evolving along separate paths. But the galaxy was vast, and no empire, no matter how strong, could remain hidden forever. The first contact between the Jedi and Sith was not a grand battle, nor was it an orchestrated invasion. It was a meeting of cultures, one built upon serenity, the other upon strength. The Jedi had long viewed themselves as guardians, their philosophy one of discipline and restraint. The Sith, having forged their power through conflict, saw the Force as a weapon, a tool to impose their will upon the weak. It was only a matter of time before these ideologies collided. Explorers, traders, and wandering scholars were the first to encounter the Sith. At first, there was no war, only caution. The Jedi did not immediately recognize the Sith for what they were. The Sith, in turn, did not see the Jedi as a threat. But curiosity soon turned to fear, and fear turned to hostility. The Sith viewed the Jedi's rejection of power as weakness. The Jedi saw the Sith's hunger for dominance as a dangerous corruption of the Force. What began as suspicion quickly escalated into something far more destructive. The first skirmishes were small, fought in the shadows of forgotten star systems. A Jedi delegation, sent to learn more of the Sith, vanished without a trace. A Sith Lord, intrigued by the teachings of the Jedi, was executed by his own kind for showing weakness. Each act of violence, each moment of distrust, deepened the rift between the two orders. Neither had sought open war, but neither could prevent what was coming. Then the conflict spread. Entire fleets were drawn into battle, their leaders no longer diplomats, but warriors. The Jedi had not built their order for war, but they adapted quickly. They took up their weapons not for conquest, but for defense, determined to stop the Sith before their influence could spread further. The Sith, reveling in the chaos, welcomed the challenge. They did not fight for peace. They fought to prove their strength, to shatter the Jedi's fragile vision of order. The battles that followed were unlike any the galaxy had seen before. This was not a war of blasters and starships alone, but a war waged through the Force itself. Jedi and Sith clashed in duels that could shatter stone, their battles altering the very landscapes upon which they fought. Star systems were consumed in the struggle, planets left in ruins as the tides of war swept through their skies. What had once been a battle between philosophies became a war of survival. There was no peace to be found. The Jedi, despite their teachings, could not simply walk away. The Sith, despite their strength, could not claim an easy victory. Each side believed the other to be a danger that could not be ignored. The Sith saw the Jedi as hypocrites, denying themselves the full potential of the Force while claiming to be its true masters. The Jedi saw the Sith as reckless tyrants, their hunger for power leading only to destruction. Neither side would yield. The war spread, consuming more than just the Jedi and the Sith. Entire governments, once neutral, were forced to choose a side. Some aligned with the Jedi, fearing the Sith's growing empire. Others saw opportunity in the Sith's rise, pledging themselves to the dark side in exchange for power. The conflict became larger than either order, drawing the galaxy into a struggle that would not end quickly. But war is not without consequence. The Jedi, forced into battle, began to question their own teachings. To take a life, even in the name of peace, was to walk dangerously close to the darkness they had sworn to resist. The Sith, though thriving in the chaos, soon learned that even strength had its limits. The war had not only made them more powerful, it had made them vulnerable. Their empire, once hidden in the shadows, was now exposed to the full might of the Jedi Order. Neither side could see the end. The war had begun, and it would shape the galaxy for generations. What had once been two distant paths had now converged, locked in a struggle that neither could escape. The conflict between Jedi and Sith had become inevitable, and the battle for the Force had only just begun. The war between the Jedi and the Sith was not fought only on battlefields. It raged in the minds of scholars, in the whispers of ancient records, in the shadows of temples where knowledge had been collected for millennia. The Force was not merely a weapon, it was a mystery, an enigma that both sides sought to understand, control, and when necessary, conceal. The Jedi, ever cautious, had long maintained great libraries of knowledge. The most revered among them was the great Jedi library on Ossus, a repository of wisdom gathered from across the galaxy. Within its walls, ancient texts described the earliest teachings of the Judii, the philosophies that had shaped the Jedi Order, and the secrets of the Force itself. But not all knowledge was meant to be freely shared. The Jedi carefully guarded the most dangerous texts, storing them away in restricted vaults, fearful of what could happen if their wisdom fell into the wrong hands. Holocrons, crystalline devices that could store and project knowledge, became the ultimate safeguard. These artifacts contained the voices and teachings of long-dead Jedi masters, preserving their wisdom for future generations. But holocrons were more than just records. They were guides, interactive guardians of the past that could teach, advise, and reveal forgotten techniques to those deemed worthy. Some contained battle strategies, others the finer points of Force healing, and a few, kept under the strictest guard, held the knowledge of the dark side itself, locked away to prevent its use. The Sith had their own archives, but theirs were far less concerned with restraint. In their temples on Korriban and Ziost, knowledge was hoarded not to be protected, but to be wielded. Sith holocrons were infused with power, their gatekeepers often manifestations of the Sith lords who had created them. These devices did not merely store history, they carried the very essence of their creators, whispering to those who sought their wisdom. Unlike the Jedi, the Sith did not believe in limiting knowledge. Power belonged to those who could claim it, and those too weak to resist corruption did not deserve to wield the Force at all. The war turned knowledge into a weapon. The Jedi sought to protect their archives, ensuring that Sith teachings did not spread. The Sith sought to corrupt or destroy Jedi records, believing that erasing the past would weaken their enemies. Entire battles were fought over libraries, with Jedi defenders making desperate stands against Sith raiders who sought to burn their history to ash. The destruction of knowledge became as devastating as the loss of warriors. The great Jedi library on Ossus became a focal point of this struggle. The Jedi knew that if it fell, centuries of wisdom would be lost, knowledge that could never be reclaimed. They reinforced its defenses, shielding it with protective barriers and hiding the most dangerous texts deep beneath its surface. But the Sith were relentless. They knew that to cripple the Jedi, they had to strike at the heart of their knowledge. Beyond Ossus, other caches of knowledge lay hidden. Coruscant, the center of galactic civilization, had its own secrets buried beneath the towering spires of its cityscape. Deep within its underlevels, forgotten vaults held relics older than the Republic itself, scrolls, holocrons, and artifacts locked away by long-forgotten scholars. Some whispered that even the Jedi did not know the full extent of what was hidden there, that buried beneath layers of history were texts so old and powerful that they had been sealed away to prevent their discovery. The Sith had their own places of hidden knowledge. Malachor, a world tainted by dark rituals, was said to hold temples filled with forbidden lore, places where the Force itself was twisted into something unnatural. There were records of experiments, of rituals designed to bend life and death, of artifacts that carried the whispers of those who had wielded them before. The Sith did not seek to protect knowledge. They sought to use it, to transform it into something that would bring them greater power. The war for knowledge was fought in shadows, in secret halls where Jedi Masters and Sith Lords alike sought to preserve, uncover, or destroy the past. For both sides, victory did not mean the end of battle. It meant control of history itself. And in that struggle, no knowledge, no matter how ancient, was truly safe. The Jedi Order did not emerge from war fully formed. It was shaped by those who carried its teachings forward, refined by the wisdom of those who had seen both triumph and failure. In the earliest days, when the Jedi were still defining their path, certain figures stood out, masters who left behind legacies that would shape the Order for millennia. Among them was Grand Master Kayla Bryn, one of the earliest known leaders of the Jedi. She was not a warrior in the traditional sense, nor did she seek conflict. Her strength lay in her mind, in her ability to see beyond the immediate battle and understand the greater currents of the Force. It was under her guidance that the Jedi Code began to take its final shape, shifting from an evolving mantra to a strict doctrine that would guide Jedi behavior. Kayla Bryn understood that war had forced the Jedi to act, but she also feared what battle had done to them. She had seen Jedi wield their power in ways that blurred the line between protector and conqueror. Even those who fought with noble intent had been changed by conflict. Some had come to enjoy the battle, to revel in the power the Force granted them. Bryn saw this as the greatest danger the Jedi faced, not the Sith, not the enemies they fought, but the risk of becoming something they had sworn to oppose. Her teachings emphasized discipline, the idea that Jedi must not only control their actions, but their emotions as well. Anger, fear, passion, these were not simply dangerous because they could lead to darkness. They were dangerous because they clouded judgment, made Jedi act impulsively rather than wisely. Under Bryn, the Order began to shift away from the Jedi philosophy of balance, embracing a more rigid structure that separated the light from the dark. But not all Jedi agreed with this path. Some, like Master Garen Brawl, believed that understanding emotions was the key to mastering them. He argued that denying feeling entirely would weaken the Jedi, leaving them detached from the very people they sought to protect. Jedi should not live as monks isolated from the world, he claimed, but as guardians who truly understood the struggles of those who relied on them. This debate, whether Jedi should suppress emotion or seek to understand it, became one of the most defining philosophical divides within the Order. It was not as visible as the war against the Sith, nor did it lead to open battle, but it shaped the way the Jedi saw themselves. Some, following Bryn's teachings, embraced serenity, detachment, and strict discipline. Others, influenced by Brol's perspective, sought balance between wisdom and feeling, believing that true mastery came not from suppression, but from self-awareness. Despite these internal debates, the Jedi grew in stature, their reputation spreading far beyond the enclaves and temples where their teachings had begun. The Republic, still young in its expansion, took notice of them. The Jedi were not rulers, nor did they seek political power, but their ability to maintain peace, to settle conflicts before they escalated into war, made them invaluable. One of the earliest recorded accounts of Jedi intervention in galactic affairs came from the Battle of Kedar. A planetary dispute between warring factions threatened to drag multiple systems into conflict, and neither side showed any sign of relenting. It was Jedi Master Rajivari who stepped between the armies, unarmed and alone, his presence halting a battle that had seemed inevitable. Through reason, through patience, through an understanding of both sides' grievances, he brokered a peace that lasted generations. Stories like these spread, cementing the Jedi as something more than just Force users. They became symbols of peace, of wisdom, of stability in an uncertain galaxy. The Republic did not officially name them as its protectors, but time and necessity led to an unspoken alliance. When conflict arose, when diplomacy failed, the Jedi were called upon to bring order without tyranny, justice without oppression. But even as the Jedi were welcomed as peacekeepers, the lessons of the past were not forgotten. They had risen from war, and the darkness they had once fought had not vanished. The Sith had been pushed into the shadows, but the Jedi knew the dark side would never truly disappear. It would wait, it would grow, and when it returned, the Jedi would be ready. The legacy of the early Jedi Masters endured not in the battles they fought, but in the philosophy they left behind. Whether through discipline or understanding, through detachment or connection, their teachings shaped the Order into what it would become. And as the galaxy turned, as new generations took up the mantle, one truth remained unshaken. The Jedi were guardians, not conquerors. They did not seek war, but when war came, they would not turn away. The Sith Empire was vast, its reach extending across countless worlds, its rulers bound together not by unity, but by power. Strength was the only law, ambition the only virtue. For the Sith, conquest was not just a means to expand their dominion, but a way to prove superiority. Yet, for all their victories against external enemies, their greatest threat had always come from within. The Sith did not seek harmony. They did not build their empire upon trust or shared ideals. Each Sith Lord ruled with the knowledge that power was fleeting, that every ally could one day become a rival, and that no throne was ever truly secure. The strong ruled, the weak perished, and betrayal was inevitable. From the moment Ajunta Pal and his exiled Dark Jedi had established the first Sith hierarchy, this reality had shaped their order. There was no guiding council, no single ruler whose word was absolute. Instead, the Sith Empire was fractured, its leadership divided among warlords, each carving out their own territory, their own legacy. What united them was the belief that strength dictated rule. What divided them was their relentless desire to claim that rule for themselves. It was not long before civil wars erupted. Sith Lords who had once stood side by side in conquest now turned against one another, their armies clashing across battlefields soaked in the dark side. Entire planets were laid to waste, not by the Jedi, but by the very rulers who claimed to lead them. Some sought to unify the Empire under a single ruler, believing that true strength came from central control. Others rejected this, seeing it as weakness, an attempt to impose order where only chaos should reign. Among these conflicts, one truth remained: no master ruled forever. Every Sith knew that their greatest threat was not the Jedi, not the Republic, but the apprentice who stood at their side. The relationship between master and student was built upon deception, manipulation, and the constant tension of power. The master trained the apprentice, guiding them in the ways of the dark side, teaching them its secrets. But the apprentice did not follow out of loyalty. They followed because they sought to surpass. It was a cycle as old as the Sith themselves. A master grew powerful, gathered followers, shaped the Sith Empire in their image. But power invited envy, and every apprentice knew that the true test of strength was not in obedience, but in the moment they would strike their master down. Those who hesitated were weak. Those who succeeded took their place. The strong ruled, and the cycle began again. The downfall of Lord Cordis was one such tale, a story whispered in the halls of Korriban's ancient tombs. Cordis had been one of the greatest Sith warlords of his time, his armies unmatched, his knowledge of Sith alchemy beyond comparison. He had forged weapons infused with dark energy, creatures molded by the Force itself. His empire stretched across half a dozen systems, his rivals crushed beneath his will. But power breeds ambition, and Cordis's apprentice, Balia Dazu, watched carefully. She served him faithfully, learning all he had to teach, waiting for the moment when his strength would begin to wane. Cordis saw her as a weapon, a blade sharpened to strike down his enemies. He never suspected that she had been watching him just as closely. When the time came, she did not hesitate. With a single stroke, she took his throne, his empire, and his legacy. His name became a footnote in Sith history, another ruler who had failed to understand that among the Sith, power was never gifted, it was taken. Betrayal was not seen as treachery among the Sith. It was an expectation, a mark of strength. Those who were weak enough to be overthrown had no right to rule in the first place. And so the Sith Empire continued, built upon the bodies of those who had once believed themselves untouchable. Yet for all their infighting, the Sith never truly fell. They were too strong, too resilient, their power too deeply rooted in the dark side. Though their wars weakened them, though their betrayals fractured their empire, they endured. Each fallen master was replaced by another. Each warlord who sought control was answered by another who hungered for more. The Republic watched from a distance, unaware of just how deeply the Sith's internal strife shaped their future. The Jedi believed that the Sith would destroy themselves, that their greed and ambition would tear them apart before they could ever become a true threat. But they underestimated the nature of the Sith. The dark side did not demand unity, it demanded survival. And the Sith had mastered that art long ago. Even as their wars raged, even as masters fell and apprentices rose, the Sith remained, waiting, watching, preparing for the day when their internal conflicts would no longer matter, when they would turn their gaze outward once more, and the Jedi would learn that while the Sith could fight among themselves for centuries, their true strength came when they set their differences aside for a single purpose: conquest. The Republic was not built in a day. It was forged over centuries, its foundations laid in the quiet agreements between distant worlds, each seeking stability in an uncertain galaxy. In the beginning, it was little more than a coalition, an alliance of systems bound by necessity rather than unity. Trade routes needed protection, disputes required resolution. No single planet could stand alone against the dangers of the unknown. The Republic offered something few had before, a vision of cooperation. It was not a government of conquest, nor did it rule through force. Instead, it spread through diplomacy, offering security and structure to those willing to join. But the Republic's survival depended on more than treaties. Words alone could not hold an empire together. It needed guardians, enforcers of peace, figures who could intervene where laws held no sway. The Jedi had never sought political power, yet they found themselves drawn into the Republic's affairs. The Order had long operated independently, existing outside the rule of kings and chancellors. Their duty was to the Force, not to governments. Yet, as the Republic expanded, it became clear that its vision aligned with their own. Where the Jedi sought harmony, the Republic sought order. Where the Jedi defended the innocent, the Republic sought to prevent war. Their goals were not identical, but they overlapped in ways neither could ignore. It was not a formal alliance at first. The Jedi were not soldiers, nor did they see themselves as enforcers of law. But the Republic's leaders recognized the power the Jedi wielded, the ability to bring peace where war threatened to take hold. When systems fell into conflict, the Jedi were called to mediate. When lawless factions sought to undermine the Republic's stability, the Jedi were sent to restore balance. They were not conquerors, nor were they rulers, yet their presence alone shaped the fate of entire star systems. Some within the Jedi Order questioned this growing involvement. The Force did not serve governments, nor did it recognize borders. To align too closely with the Republic was to risk becoming entangled in its politics, its ambitions, its inevitable conflicts. A Jedi's duty was to the Force, not to a senate of politicians whose decisions were shaped by agendas and power struggles. Others saw the Republic as a necessity. Without stability, there could be no peace. If the Jedi did not stand with the Republic, then chaos would take hold, and the darkness they had fought for generations would find new footholds. The Sith had fallen into obscurity, but their influence had not disappeared. Corruption, ambition, war, these forces did not need a name to exist. The Republic, for all its flaws, was the only force capable of uniting the galaxy against them. The question of the Jedi's role was never fully answered. It remained an open debate, shaping the Order's choices for centuries. Some Jedi remained distant from political affairs, focusing solely on their connection to the Force. Others worked closely with Republic officials, believing that true peace could not be achieved without direct action. The Jedi did not rule, nor did they seek to control the Republic's path. But their presence in the galaxy became undeniable. As the Republic grew, so did the Jedi's responsibilities. They were called to the frontiers, to newly settled worlds where law was still fragile. They helped establish order, not through governance, but through mediation and protection. When disputes arose, they settled them. When threats emerged, they stood in defense of those who could not protect themselves. Their influence was felt far beyond their temples. To the people of the Republic, they became more than scholars or mystics. They were symbols of justice, of wisdom, of an ideal greater than the governments they assisted. In the eyes of many, the Republic did not merely survive because of diplomacy or trade agreements. It endured because the Jedi stood watch over it. Yet, even as they cemented their place in galactic affairs, the Jedi knew that peace was never absolute. The Republic's growth was not without opposition. Not all worlds wished to join its fold. Not all saw its expansion as a force for good. And beyond the edges of known space, beyond the stars that marked the Republic's reach, something else was waiting, watching, preparing. The Jedi had risen alongside the Republic, but their greatest tests were yet to come. The Force moved, as it always had, shifting in ways that few could foresee. And while the Jedi had sworn themselves to peace, the galaxy was far from done with war. The journey back to Tython was not one of conquest or expansion. It was one of reflection, a pilgrimage undertaken by Jedi seeking answers lost to time. The Republic had flourished, the Sith had been cast into the shadows, and yet, within the Order, there were those who questioned the path that had been taken. The Jedi had become warriors, defenders of the Republic's ideals, but in doing so, had they strayed too far from what the Force had once revealed to their ancestors? Tython had been abandoned for centuries. After the Force Wars, when the Judii had fractured and the Jedi Order emerged, the planet had faded from memory. Its storms had raged, its balance disrupted, its purpose forgotten. But history had a way of calling out to those who still listened. The Jedi, for all their discipline, knew that wisdom was not found only in holocrons or temples. It was etched into the very essence of the Force, waiting to be rediscovered. When the first Jedi pilgrims arrived, they found a world unchanged by time, yet altered by absence. The land bore no temples, no grand structures to mark its importance. What remained were whispers, traces of what had once been. The Force had never left Tython, but it had grown restless. The planet, once a place of harmony, carried an unease that rippled through the air like a long-forgotten warning. As the Jedi explored, they encountered something beyond mere ruins. The echoes of the past lingered, taking shape not in stone, but in the Force itself. Some saw figures from an era long gone, Jedi masters standing in silent contemplation, their forms flickering like candlelight before vanishing. Others felt the weight of ancient teachings pressing upon them, voices carried on the wind, reminding them of the balance their predecessors had once held sacred. But Tython was not welcoming. It tested those who walked upon its surface. Jedi who had devoted their lives to serenity found their emotions stirred in ways they could not explain. The planet did not rage as it once had during the Force Wars, but it was unsettled, questioning those who now called themselves its heirs. One Jedi, Master Villaran, who had spent years seeking understanding beyond the rigid doctrine of the modern order, felt the greatest disturbance. As he meditated in the valley where the first Judii had once gathered, he sensed a presence, neither Sith nor Jedi, neither light nor dark. It was something older, something that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless philosophies. It did not speak in words, nor did it reveal itself as an entity. It was simply there, watching, waiting for those who would listen. The Jedi who had come to Tython did not all interpret its messages the same way. Some saw the visions as tests, illusions meant to challenge their resolve. Others believed they were warnings, reminders of what had been lost. But one truth could not be ignored. The Jedi had changed. The balance once sought by the Judii had been set aside, replaced by an unwavering devotion to Ashla, the light. The dark side was seen only as corruption, something to be denied, rather than a force that existed as part of the universe itself. Some among the Jedi began to wonder if their rejection of balance had weakened them. The Sith thrived in their understanding of passion, of power, of ambition. They wielded the dark side without restraint. But did that mean the Jedi were right to reject it completely? The Judii had walked both paths, believing that only through balance could one truly understand the Force. Had the Jedi strayed too far from this truth? Yet even as these thoughts took root, the pilgrims knew they could not turn back so easily. The Jedi Order was built upon discipline, upon selflessness, upon a commitment to peace. To embrace the full spectrum of the Force, as the Jedi once had, was to risk the very corruption they had fought so hard to prevent. Tython offered no answers, only questions, and each Jedi who stepped upon its surface had to face those questions alone. As the pilgrims prepared to leave, some carried with them a newfound sense of doubt, others a renewed faith in the Order's path. But all left with the understanding that Tython had not been forgotten. It remained a part of their history, a reminder of the choices that had shaped their destiny. The Jedi had grown beyond the Judii, but whether they had grown wiser was something only time would reveal. The Jedi Order had always believed in discipline, in the power of restraint and wisdom to guide their path. Yet across the centuries, that path had never remained untouched by conflict. The Force was not a single, unbroken current. It surged, it twisted, and it called to those who sought to master it in different ways. For all their teachings, the Jedi could not prevent one simple truth. Some among them would always seek more. The first great schism began as a quiet division, a whisper of discontent among Jedi, who believed that the Order's strict rejection of passion was limiting their true potential. They did not see the dark side as corruption, but as another aspect of the Force, one that should be studied, understood, and even wielded. The Jedi Council disagreed. The dangers of Bogan had been proven, they argued. The Sith had once been Jedi, and the war between light and dark had nearly destroyed them all. To study the dark side was to invite it, to open the door to something that could not be controlled. But those who questioned the Jedi's teachings did not see themselves as Sith. They did not wish to conquer, nor did they believe themselves to be evil. They believed they were uncovering the truth that the Order refused to face, that to wield the Force fully, one could not deny half of its nature. When the Council declared them heretics, when their teachings were outlawed, there was no longer room for debate. They were cast out, forced to choose between submission or exile. Some left willingly, disappearing into the outer rim, their fates unknown. Others refused to surrender and took up arms against their former brothers and sisters. The war that followed reshaped the Order, leaving scars that would never truly heal. The Jedi had not simply defeated an enemy. They had cast out a part of themselves, a philosophy that, no matter how many times it was purged, would always return. Centuries passed, but the cycle continued. Each time the Jedi re-established their dominance, new divisions would form. The exiles of the first schism faded into legend, but others took their place. The dark side called to those who sought power, to those who rejected the notion that restraint was the only path to mastery. The Jedi would rebuild, only for another faction to break away. The Force itself seemed to demand this struggle, an endless battle between those who sought peace and those who sought dominion. And while the Jedi fractured, the Sith adapted. The fall of the first Sith Empire had not been its end. Those who had survived the Jedi's wrath did not fade into obscurity. They learned from their failures, rebuilding in secret, waiting for the right moment to rise again. And when they did, they were more cunning, more ruthless than before. The Sith no longer sought open war as they once had. They infiltrated, they manipulated, they played the long game, waiting for the Jedi to weaken themselves through their own divisions. This was the way of the Sith. They did not build empires meant to last forever. They built legacies of destruction, of chaos, ensuring that even if they fell, they would drag their enemies down with them. And when the galaxy believed them gone, when the Jedi thought themselves victorious, the Sith would return, stronger than before. No matter how many times the Sith were cast down, they never truly vanished. No matter how many times the Jedi purged their ranks of dissenters, new schisms would always form. It was as if the Force itself demanded conflict, as if the struggle between light and dark was not something that could ever be resolved, but something that had to play out over and over until the end of time. And so the cycle continued. The Jedi stood as guardians of peace, only for some among them to reject that peace. The Sith built empires, only for those empires to collapse beneath their own ambition. And the galaxy, caught between them, watched as the battle repeated itself across the ages. The Jedi sought to break the cycle. The Sith sought to control it. But the Force, vast and unknowable, had its own will, and it had never promised peace. Before the Jedi, before the Sith, before the Republic took its first steps toward unity, the galaxy had already been shaped by an ancient power. The Rakata, a species as advanced as they were ruthless, had built an empire that spanned the stars, ruling with technology so advanced that even the civilizations that followed struggled to understand its full scope. Their dominion, known as the Infinite Empire, was not founded upon diplomacy or cooperation. It was built through conquest, through the unchecked use of the dark side, through the belief that power was meant to be taken and wielded without restraint. The Rakata were not merely rulers, they were masters of the Force, but unlike the Jedi who would later rise, they did not seek balance or wisdom. To them, the Force was not a guide. It was a tool, a means to exert their will upon the galaxy. They channeled the dark side not as a philosophy, but as a force of oppression, using it to fuel their war machines, their grand cities, and their most terrifying creation, the Star Forge. The Star Forge was unlike anything the galaxy had seen before or since. A massive, sentient factory built within the heart of a dying star, it could create warships, weapons, and armies on an unimaginable scale. But its power did not come from raw materials alone. It fed on the dark side, drawing energy from the suffering and conflict that surrounded it, twisting the will of those who sought to control it. The Rakata used it to expand their reach, ensuring that no world could resist them, no enemy could withstand their endless fleets. For thousands of years, the Infinite Empire ruled unchecked. They enslaved entire species, stripping planets of their resources, leaving nothing but ruin in their wake. They were not content with mere dominion. They sought to reshape the galaxy in their image, to bend all life to their will. But for all their power, for all their mastery of the Force and technology, the Rakata were not invincible. Their downfall did not come from an external enemy. It came from within. The dark side, which had fueled their rise, also planted the seeds of their destruction. Corruption spread through their ranks, their hunger for power turning them against one another. Wars broke out between factions. Entire worlds were lost to infighting, and their once mighty fleets were shattered by their own arrogance. And then, without warning, a plague unlike anything seen before swept through the Rakata, devastating their population. Some believed it was the will of the Force, a natural consequence of their unchecked cruelty. Others saw it as the result of their experiments, a creation of their own making that they could not control. Whatever the cause, the Rakata fell. Their empire, once eternal, crumbled. The species that had suffered under their rule rose up, driving them from the worlds they had once commanded. The Star Forge, their greatest weapon, was abandoned, left drifting in the void. The Rakata, once the most powerful beings in the galaxy, became little more than a forgotten relic, their name erased from history by those who had once feared them. Yet, their influence did not vanish. The ruins of their civilization remained, scattered across the stars, their technology waiting to be uncovered. The Sith, drawn to the power they had once wielded, sought out their secrets, hoping to reclaim the knowledge that had fueled their empire. Even the Jedi, though wary of their legacy, could not ignore the traces they had left behind. The Rakata were gone, but their shadow remained. The Force had been twisted in ways that could never be undone, and those who came after them, Jedi, Sith, and all who sought to wield power, would forever walk the path they had first carved into the stars. Long before the Jedi and Sith waged their wars, before the Republic spread its influence across the stars, there were whispers of a deeper truth hidden within the Force. The earliest Judii, those who first walked the path of balance on Tython, spoke of cycles, of a rhythm within the Force that could not be broken, only repeated. They saw the rise and fall of civilizations, the constant struggle between light and dark, and they understood that the Force itself was never stagnant. It moved, shifted, and corrected. Among their ancient texts, carved into stone and preserved within holocrons lost to time, there were references to a champion, a figure who would rise in times of great imbalance, not to destroy one side or the other, but to restore what had been lost. The earliest of these writings did not name this figure, nor did they describe them in exact terms. Some saw them as a warrior, others as a guide, but all agreed on one thing: the Force did not allow extremes to last forever. The Jedi believed that whenever the galaxy leaned too far in one direction, when darkness or light grew too strong, the Force would manifest a being who could shift its course. This was not an act of fate, nor the will of any godlike entity, but the natural order asserting itself. Just as Tython had once erupted into storms when its balance was disturbed, so too did the Force react when its harmony was threatened. These beliefs, once held sacred by the Judii, were largely dismissed by the Jedi who followed. The Jedi Order, having embraced the light, saw the dark side as something to be rejected outright, a corruption rather than a necessary element of existence. They no longer spoke of balance as the Judii had, nor did they believe that the Force worked in cycles. To them, the goal was simple: eradicate the dark side, and peace would be permanent. But the past could not be ignored. Jedi scholars, searching through the ruins of Tython and the fragments of Jedi knowledge that remained, uncovered references to a being who would bring balance to the Force. The wording varied, the meanings obscured by centuries of interpretation, but one phrase appeared time and again: the Chosen One. It was a title without a name, a prophecy without a clear meaning. Some Jedi saw it as a metaphor, a warning against allowing their order to become stagnant. Others feared its implications. If the Force itself sought balance, did that mean the Jedi were wrong to push only for the light? The Sith too had their own interpretations. Some dismissed the prophecy as Jedi superstition, but others believed in it more deeply than the Jedi themselves. They saw the Chosen One not as a restorer of balance, but as a bringer of destruction, someone who would shatter the Republic, break the Jedi Order, and allow the Sith to reclaim their rightful dominance. For centuries they sought this figure, hoping to mold them into a weapon of darkness rather than an agent of balance. Throughout history, there were those who were thought to be the fulfillment of this prophecy. Some believed Revan, a Jedi Knight turned Sith Lord who later sought redemption, had been the one destined to bring balance. He had walked both paths, embraced both light and dark, and in the end had turned away from both to forge his own destiny. Others pointed to the fall of the Old Republic, to the rise and fall of the Sith empires, believing that each great conflict was merely another step in the Force's attempt to correct itself. But the prophecy did not fade. It persisted, waiting for the moment when it would be truly fulfilled. And in the final days of the Republic, as the Jedi stood at the height of their power, yet blind to the darkness rising around them, whispers of the Chosen One returned. There were those who believed Anakin Skywalker was the one spoken of in the ancient texts. Born of unknown origins, his connection to the Force was stronger than any Jedi before him. The Jedi saw him as their greatest hope, the one who would bring an end to the Sith and usher in an era of true peace. But others, those who had studied the old prophecies more carefully, saw something deeper. The Force did not promise victory to one side or the other. It promised balance. And balance did not mean the destruction of darkness. It meant equilibrium between the two. The Jedi, in their pursuit of light, had failed to see what was happening before them. The Sith had adapted, changed, hidden in the shadows where they could not be so easily erased. The Republic, bloated and corrupt, had become the very kind of extreme that the Force would seek to correct. And Anakin, the supposed chosen one, did not fulfill the role they had imagined. He did not bring an era of Jedi dominance. He did not destroy the Sith in the way they had hoped. Instead, he became part of the very cycle the Force had always followed. Through him, the Jedi were broken. Through him, the Sith rose once more. And through him, balance was eventually restored, not through the destruction of one side, but through the resetting of the cycle itself. The Jedi Order fell, the Sith ruled, and in time, both were undone. The Force had not promised a savior, it had promised correction, and so the prophecy endured. Long after Anakin's time, after Luke Skywalker rose to rebuild what had been lost, after new wars and new conflicts threatened to repeat the mistakes of the past, the legend of the Chosen One remained. Some still believed it referred to a single individual, someone yet to come, who would finally break the cycle for good. Others saw it as something more, an eternal truth about the nature of the Force itself. The Jedi had understood it long ago, before the Jedi and Sith had given their conflict names. The Force does not favor one side over the other. It does not seek conquest, nor does it seek peace. It moves, it shifts, and it ensures that whenever one extreme takes hold, something will rise to bring it back into balance. The cycle was not broken. It never had been. It never would be. The Chosen One was not a singular being, but an inevitability. And as long as the Force endured, as long as light and dark struggled for control, there would always be another. The Force is not a tool, nor is it bound by the desires of those who seek to wield it. It is not merely light or dark, nor can it be controlled in absolutes. It moves, it shifts, it calls, and it corrects. From the earliest days of the Judii on Tython to the rise and fall of Jedi and Sith alike, the Force has remained the silent witness to history, always present, always guiding, always seeking balance. It is easy to think of the Jedi and Sith as opposing forces, locked in an endless struggle between light and darkness. But history has shown that their battle is not a contest of good versus evil. It is a reflection of the galaxy's natural rhythm, an ebb and flow that has shaped civilizations for millennia. The Jedi sought harmony through discipline, rejecting passion to maintain serenity. The Sith embraced emotion, believing that strength came from the unshackled pursuit of power. And between them, the galaxy trembled, torn between order and chaos. Yet neither side could truly claim victory. When the Jedi flourished, darkness gathered in the shadows, waiting for its moment to strike. When the Sith reigned, their rule collapsed under the weight of their own ambition. The rise and fall of each was not random. It was the Force correcting itself, ensuring that neither extreme could endure unchecked. The Jedi understood this long before their teachings were cast aside. They saw the Force as something to be walked alongside, not controlled. Ashla and Bogan, light and dark, were not enemies but parts of a greater whole. Their balance was fragile, yet it was the only true way to exist in harmony with the Force. But balance is not simple, nor is it easy to maintain. It demands understanding, self-awareness, and the acceptance that both light and dark will always exist. Throughout history, the Force has revealed this truth again and again. The Jedi, in their pursuit of purity, became rigid, so devoted to their ideals that they could not see their own flaws. The Sith, in their hunger for power, became consumed by their own destruction. And so the cycle continued, each generation repeating the mistakes of those who came before, believing themselves to be different, believing that they could finally bring an end to the struggle. But the Force does not seek an end. It does not crave stillness. It is alive, flowing through all things, shaping the fate of those who listen to it. It is not loyal to the Jedi or the Sith, nor does it bend to the will of rulers or warriors. It moves where it must, guiding those who are open to its call. Perhaps this is what balance truly means, not the dominance of one side over the other, not the eradication of darkness or the triumph of light, but the understanding that both exist, always, and that neither can be denied. It is not a war to be won. It is the heartbeat of the galaxy, the pulse of existence itself. For all their wisdom, the Jedi never fully accepted this. For all their power, the Sith never understood it. But the Force remains, watching, waiting, knowing that in time, the cycle will begin again. The story of the Force is as old as the stars, woven into the rise and fall of civilizations, whispered through the teachings of those who sought to understand it. From the earliest Judii to the towering legends of the Jedi and Sith, history has moved in currents, guided by those who embraced its power and those who sought to control it. Long ago, on Tython, seekers of wisdom looked to the Force as a great balance, Ashla and Bogan, light and dark, two halves of a whole. The Judii did not seek to conquer one side or the other, only to understand. But understanding is not always enough. When the Force Wars shattered Tython's balance, when the Jedi emerged from the ruins with a new path, the seeds of conflict were planted. The Jedi chose the light, believing it was the key to harmony. They built their temples, spread their teachings, and vowed to protect peace. Yet peace was never simple. The dark side did not vanish. It did not yield to the will of those who feared it. It waited. It called to those who saw power as their birthright. And when the moment was right, it returned. The Sith rose from the very ranks of the Jedi, not as invaders from beyond, but as those who had once walked the same path. Their war was inevitable. Across centuries, across countless worlds, Jedi and Sith clashed again and again, their conflict shaping the fate of the galaxy. No matter how many times one side fell, the other could never stand unchallenged for long. The Sith built empires, only for their own betrayals to destroy them. The Jedi upheld peace, only for their own blindness to let darkness slip through the cracks. Each believed they could break the cycle, yet the Force had no end, no single victory that would silence the struggle forever. The ancient Rakata, long before Jedi or Sith, had wielded the Force without restraint, bending it to fuel their infinite empire. They had fallen, consumed by their own arrogance, their once mighty dominion reduced to forgotten ruins. The Force had not chosen their side, nor had it mourned their passing. It had simply moved forward. Those who came after them, Judii, Jedi, Sith, Skywalkers, were part of the same current. Each era carried echoes of the past, lessons that were learned and forgotten in equal measure. For every warrior who swore to uphold the light, another was drawn to the dark. For every temple raised in the name of wisdom, another crumbled under the weight of ambition. The Force did not belong to the Jedi, nor did it serve the Sith. It flowed through all things, a silent presence watching as civilizations rose and fell, as balance shifted and corrected itself. And so the cycle continued. The names changed, the battles took different forms, but the current remained the same. The Jedi Order, with all its wisdom, could not erase the dark side. The Sith, with all their cunning, could not extinguish the light. They were bound together, not by choice but by nature itself, forever shaping one another. Even as history moved forward, as the age of the Republic faded into legend, the same struggles played out. A boy born into slavery became the fulcrum upon which the Force turned. A son rose from the ashes of a fallen order, not to destroy the Sith, but to understand the path his father had walked. The Force did not seek heroes or villains. It sought balance, and when the galaxy fell too far in one direction, it would always find a way to correct its course. Perhaps the Jedi had understood this better than the Jedi ever had. Perhaps in their search for balance, they had glimpsed a truth that was later lost to time. The Force is neither a weapon nor a prize to be won. It is not a battlefield where light must conquer darkness or where darkness must swallow the light. It is a current, endless and ever-moving, guiding those who listen, shaping those who refuse. Its story is not finished. It never will be. The Force remains, as it always has, as it always will. And as the galaxy turns once more, as new seekers step forward to follow its call, its whispers echo in the quiet places of history, waiting to be heard. May these ancient whispers guide your dreams.